Good evening. Today is Monday, December 12th, 2022, and this is the 129th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My honored guest is a dear friend of mine, Chuck Holton. Chuck is coming to us today live from Ukraine and the front lines. Chuck is a U.S. Army veteran of Operation Just Cause in Panama and a former member of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and more importantly, author and also a U.S. war correspondent. Chuck has been on the front lines protecting America and Americans since leaving the service by bringing us the ground view of the truth, as well as contributing to the Christian Broadcasting Network, or CBN, as well as being a cameraman for Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and his weblog, Boots on the Ground. And more importantly, Chuck has his own podcast, The Hot Zone with Chuck Holton. Chuck has been covering the conflict in Europe even before it started, and is here today to discuss the Russian winter offensive and whether or not the war in Ukraine is being engaged in order to empower Ukraine or to save Europe. But before we bring Chuck in, I do want to start off with the most recent video that he provided us from Ukraine itself.
While big cities across Ukraine are struggling to keep the lights on and have to contend with the daily threat of rocket attacks, the closer one gets to the front lines, the worse it gets. The Russians have a near limitless supply of artillery, so anywhere within the range of those guns is being pounded without mercy. The town of Orihyiv was once home to about 20,000 people, but the power has been off here most of the time since June, and Russian shelling has reduced much of this city to rubble. Many of the 2,000 or so people who remain say they have no choice but to stay. This village is only a few miles from the front lines, and it's under fire every day because the strategy the Russians are using is to basically just bomb these towns into submission, terrorize the people into leaving, and then they can move in without any resistance. But these villagers are not going along with that plan. They're staying here in the village, but they're living down in the cellars of this apartment building. Let's go take a look. Here? Svetlana has 5 children, and she's been staying in this basement since June. You can see how smoky it is here now because they're using this green firewood to try and keep the place warm. And they're living in a tiny little section of this basement. Why haven't you left and gone somewhere else?
No, I want to live on my land and my Ukrainian land. And I hope that my city will be delivered soon.
American NGOs like Orphans Promise are helping people like Svetlana stay alive through the winter by delivering food, medicines, and warm clothing to people from the local church who are staying with their families to help those who can't leave.
And I see that these people who are still be here, this church, who are served people here, they fighting for me too. It's like another level of soldiers. It's really very dangerous to be Ukrainians right now. Nobody know who will be next. It doesn't matter where you are, in Kyiv, in West Ukraine, in Lviv. It doesn't matter. Or here in front line, you don't know who will be next.
In southern Ukraine, I'm Chuck Holton for Newsmax.
Chuck, it's good to have you here again, buddy. I know it's difficult where you are, especially with what's happening with the grid being hit by the Russians and the energy issues that the Ukrainians are facing. Tell us where we are at this stage of the war since it began.
That's right. Well, I'm operating on battery power as we speak here. We have no power, no internet. We actually have it pretty well though. Here in Kyiv, the power comes and goes. We have rolling blackouts every few hours. So we'll have power for a couple hours and it'll go off for a couple hours. And our water supply was hit a little over a week ago. So we went without water for a day while they got that fixed. We have water back now, but it's kind of the color of iced tea. So you don't want to use it for anything but washing. And so we have to have bottled water. When the power goes out, the internet goes out. That's the really difficult thing. So what I have to do is connect 5 different cell service cellular chips to this laptop that I'm using. And I have software program that threads the little bit of bandwidth each one of them has into one stream, and then it enables me to send out the video stream over the airwaves. So any one cell phone would not have enough bandwidth to send a video stream, but by putting 5 of them together, I'm able to get that out. That's only a problem because not all of those streams have batteries that I can plug into a USB power source. And so they're running on battery, and when they're out, they're out. Then I have to wait for the power to come back on and recharge them. So it's actually more of an annoyance here in Kyiv than anything. What's really difficult is the people who are living out in the villages like Orikhiv out there that have literally gone months without electricity or running water. They're having to get their power from either solar, which you don't get a lot of this time of year, or just go without. Their water comes from wells or from the river. This is really sending them back to the 1800s in a way. And they are completely reliant on aid from people like Orphans Promise, Samaritan's Purse, to bring food into them. Otherwise, they'd have no food. Now, these people are very resilient people. They're used to hardship. Their lifestyle in good times is nowhere near the level that most Americans have. So they are used to storing up food for the winter, putting up firewood, and being somewhat self-sufficient. But there is a limit to that. This is the 21st century, and so it is difficult for them to go without that. The more difficult thing is what you see here is the constant shelling that they have to deal with. And a lot of people ask, like, why wouldn't they leave? Why wouldn't everybody leave? Well, that was a town of 20,000 people down there. Now it's 2,000, so it's down by 90%. But the reason that those 2,000 people are still there is either they literally have nowhere to go. They don't have any idea how to travel. You recall, this was a Soviet Union up until 30 years ago. So people that are my age grew up under the Soviet Union, where you were not allowed to travel outside of your village without special paperwork. And so they never did. I've met many, many people here who literally have never been more than 25 kilometers from the place they were born. And so because of that, they don't even know what to do to travel. They don't know how that works. They don't have a passport, and they certainly don't have any money. And so they just figure, I'm staying put. The other group of people is just people who are stubborn, who say, my great-grandparents suffered through World War I, and my grandparents suffered through World War II, and the Holodomor, and there's no way I'm giving up this land. I'm going to stay here until I die. So it is certainly becoming a hard winter, and with the additional difficulty of all that shelling, about 90% of the buildings in Orikhiv now are damaged or destroyed. The house, the family that I stayed with are a couple of these pastors who have stayed simply to help the other people who can't leave. And they had an artillery shell land 50 feet from their house. And just lucky for them that it was a dud, and it left a sizable crater, but it didn't actually go off as like a low order detonation. So it didn't destroy their house. But I tell you, it is, in one sense, absolutely maddening to see how the Russians are intentionally targeting civilians nonstop in this war. They're not, by and large, they're not targeting military targets anymore. They are almost out of precision munitions. They don't have the ability to take out precise military targets that much. And so at least 70%, or if not more, of all of the munitions that they fire at Ukraine are landing in civilian areas aimed at civilian targets or civilian infrastructure, which is literally a constant stream of war crimes that Russia is perpetrating on the people here.
Well, Chuck, we kind of knew this was coming. Everybody has seen the pattern going back, for a while. And look, even if you want to go back to how Chechnya war was waged, you kind of saw the pattern. Question here is, what was being done to prepare for this date? Because we all knew that, even the Russians are currently, again, in the areas that they have lost their footprint. We've seen probes taking place against Ukrainian forces, and we know that there's a possibility of a Russian winter offensive coming. With that said, are the Ukrainian forces, when it comes to the availability of their ammunition, in a position where they could maybe even not just block, but maybe counterattack the Russians during this winter offensive? Or is it so bad when it comes to the supplies that are getting in, whether it be from Poland or other NATO nations, that we might see a further setback or a lengthening of this war past the 1-year cycle in February?
I certainly do not think the war will be over by February. Russia has proven that it has a very deep ability to absorb losses on the battlefield, because they literally don't care about their soldiers, and they will continue to throw bodies at this. Right now, they're essentially trying to drown Ukraine in Russian bodies, Russian corpses. The Russians, as you know, have lost about 100,000 people. That's about, from all available information, this is not just what you hear from the Ukrainians, but from open source intel and from intelligence agencies of Western countries. It looks like Russia has lost 6 or 7 soldiers for every one that Ukraine has lost, which is still staggering losses on the part of Ukraine. But on the part of Russia, it's just absolutely ridiculous. 100,000 people in 10 months dead. And that doesn't even include wounded. As you know, the ratio of wounded to dead is usually 2 to 1 at least, maybe 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1. I would say it's closer to 2 to 1, because we have some evidence that Russia is actually shooting its wounded and isn't even bothering to try to patch them up or anything. Russia is sustaining absolutely horrific losses. They have lost so much equipment in Ukraine that they have become the single largest donor of military equipment to Ukraine, even more than the Western countries. So the Ukrainians jokingly call Russia, they call it the Russian Lend-Lease program. And Ukraine has done a very good job of mobilizing its troops. They are now up to over 750,000 men under arms. That is about 3 times what Russia has on the field right now. So the Ukrainians outnumber the Russians. They have much better equipment than the Russians. They don't have more when it comes to artillery, and this is largely an artillery war. So Russia, not rockets, but when it comes to actual artillery, Russia is firing 9 artillery shells for every 1 that Ukraine fires. Fortunately, Ukraine is much more accurate, although that accuracy has been degraded somewhat just by the sheer volume of fire. As you know, artillery pieces do wear out over time, and Ukraine has been wearing them out as fast as they can. They are using their tanks as artillery pieces now. And so up on the front lines where I have been, it's largely been an artillery battle, which means that the front lines are 2 to 5 kilometers apart. There's not a lot of small arms battle because they don't get close enough to each other to do that, except in notable places like Bakhmut. And so along the rest of the front line, they're just trading artillery. Russia shoots 10 rounds, Ukraine shoots 1 and blows up the artillery piece that shot the 10 rounds. Again, we're seeing Russia indiscriminately target civilian areas. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been very strategic about the targets that it aims at and hits. And that's one of the reasons why they're winning on the battlefield. They are just systematically destroying Russia's logistics train, their tail, and they're not bothering so much to try to destroy their frontline units. They're using their heavy stuff like HIMARS and long-range rockets to go after Russia's logistics support activities in the rear. And that enables them to continually cut off Russia's ability to resupply its troops. What that means is that I highly doubt there will be a Russian offensive in the winter because Russian soldiers literally are being sent out here without socks, and it's below freezing. It was very cold. We already have reports of Russian soldiers freezing to death on the battlefield, and Ukrainian troops are much better suited for the winter warfare. And Ukraine is pushing very hard by hitting these logistic support activities behind the enemy lines. So what I saw when I was in Zaporizhia last week is that the Russians are, it appears, making preparations to pull out of Zaporizhia. That would be a massive loss on their part. It was one of the most important objectives in the beginning of the war. I really believe that one of the large actual reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine was because of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And recall, those power plants were built under the Soviet Union, and they were connected to the Soviet grid, even up until February 24th. Those power plants inside Ukraine were connected to the Russian grid, and that means that they're contributing to the Russian power grid and allowing power inside Russia. So when you ask, Zaporizhia provides power for 4 million people, where are those 4 million people? It's hard to say because it's kind of like all the power plants dump water into a bucket, and then the people who need power take water out of the bottom of the bucket. So you don't know which power is going to which person. But for the last couple of years, the Ukrainians have been planning to transition the Zaporizhia power plant, among others, to the European power grid and start providing power over there. And Russia kept telling them, don't do it. Don't do that. We're not going to allow that. Well, they made the first test where they disconnected the Zaporizhia power plant and connected it to the European grid on February 24th. And 4 hours later, the Russians invaded. So and that was one of the very first objectives they went for, was the Zaporizhia power plant. They do not want these power plants to be connected to the European power grid, because the Russian power grid is even more. A couple of years ago, I made a documentary about how vulnerable the U.S. power grid is, how fragile it is because it's old and outdated and obsolete. If the U.S. power grid is old, outdated, and obsolete, you can imagine how bad a shape the Russian power grid is in. And taking 4 million users away from the Russian power grid could literally cause the Russian power grid to collapse completely for a matter of years and plunge all of Russia into darkness. That's a real possibility. I sat with the head of the Ukrainian power company for a couple of hours the other day, and we talked about this, and he's like, hey, look, it's not a simple thing so you don't just throw a switch and move from the from the Russian to the European power grid. Because it's different wavelengths, it's a whole different system, and we have to completely change that over. But once Russia attacked Ukraine in February 24th, that process, which should have taken more than a year, took 6 weeks. We got it done in 6 weeks. And so Russia has lost Zaporizhia already. It's going to be very, very difficult to ever reconnect it to the Russian power grid. So they appear to be making plans now to pull out of Zaporizhia. And again, that'll be another very bad loss of face for Vladimir Putin.
Well, I know as you're mentioning it, all these issues with energy, especially with the winter being a week away on the 21st, and you see the snow on the ground already where you're at. Poland, I know for a fact that they've been requesting support for energy. They're looking for coal. They're looking for heavy crude, if possible, light crude to burn. I do know that when we're looking at providing oil to our NATO partners, it's not just, especially when it comes to coal, there's a certain type, it's like their systems been set up on burning certain type of a coal and capability. And some of the issues that we're dealing with because of the sanctions that have been placed on, whether it be the SCO-linked countries, the Shanghai Cooperation countries like Russia and Iran and others, it makes it a little bit difficult to provide the type of a coal that is needed even for Poland to be able to burn, to be able to sustain their systems. When it comes to this energy crisis, as you see it on the ground and you're dealing with it, regardless of what happens, do you believe that Ukraine is going to be able to get the needed energy capabilities to sustain it. And the other piece I do want you to kind of caveat on also is the fact you mentioned about the artillery pieces. You know, we were looking at trying to get artillery support specifically for the Ukrainians, but those are Russian-made artillery rounds. And, you know, we won't mention which company, but a British company came in months ago and bought up pretty much all the stock that is out there. I know everybody's scrambling to look for where the pieces might be buried from Africa to the Middle East. But they do need those rounds to be able to use them on their Russian-made artillery systems in order to be able to still continue waging war against the Russians. Where do you see the energy coming from, and where do you see the possibility of these maybe ammunitions that might be out there that maybe the Ukrainians are able to tap into, given the fact that most of the stock out there might be purchased already? And then I do want to talk to you a little bit later on some of the issues we're having even with our javelins that were provided to the Ukrainians.
Okay, so when it comes to power, I'll just say that Ukraine is making serious plans right now to literally be without power completely for the remainder of the winter. They're stocking up on firewood. Of course, Ukraine has a lot of forest, and so they've been doing that for some time. They've clear-cut areas out in the west of this country, and there is a large amount of firewood, and there are large numbers of generators and wood stoves being shipped into this country. For example, in the last month, they've brought in about 300,000 generators from Europe. There's one running right outside my apartment right now that's powering the coffee shop down at the bottom of the building here. One of the things that Ukraine is looking into and is working toward is a more distributed system of power. I don't know all the details with how they're doing that. I can infer some things just from my knowledge. When I was a stockbroker, I used to invest in that industry. There is a system called advanced microturbine power systems, which are basically turbine generators that are about the size of a refrigerator, and they cost about $30,000 a piece. They can provide power for up to 4 homes, and they are installed in a distributed network. Think of rather than one central computer server, they have servers all over the world that can all pick up the slack for each other. It's like that, and so they install these microturbine generators all over the place. They network them all together, and these things will run on just about anything. There's a Capstone Microturbine. You should look it up. This company called Capstone Microturbine that makes these microturbine generators that will run on sub-quality methane, like from a digester, from a hog farm or something. They'll run on the methane generated by a landfill. They'll run on jet fuel. They'll run on diesel fuel. They'll run on cooking oil, anything. And they're very low maintenance. They're very high output for what they do, and they produce hot air as a byproduct of them running, so they can also be used for heat. They're looking at that. They've already set up around this country more than 3,500 what they call invincibility points. That these are tents or buildings inside in the center of villages all around this country where people can go. They have a generator like this that's set up. They can get warm. They can charge their devices and call people and stuff like that. That's all free, and they are making preparations if need be to survive the winter in these invincibility points. I already know people here in Kyiv whose apartments are completely run by electricity. So when they don't have electricity, they don't have heat, and their homes are just an icebox. But they just have lots of blankets. They're just using candles and whatever they can to warm up. They're using these little clay pot heaters to heat one house. The whole family lives in that room in the house when it's cold, and they're fine. Fortunately, where I live, our heat system is independent from the electricity system because it's a boiler system, just like the old Soviet Union. Many people in the States don't understand how this works. In the old Soviet Union, neighborhoods had a heat system that they all shared. It was communist heating. And so there was one boiler building. Mine is right across the street here from my apartment. I can see it out my window. And that boiler system is run by coal or wood or natural gas or all three. It heats a large tank of water to boiling temperatures and then pushes that water out through a system of pipes into every building in the area, in the immediate area, and runs it through radiators. So there's a radiator on my wall right here that's still hot, even though we have no electricity right now, because that boiler system is still running. So in one sense, that communist heating system is a distributed heat network that keeps the heat on. It would be very difficult for Russia to blow up all of those heating networks because there's one for every neighborhood, right? Now, in some of the smaller villages, they didn't have those, or else they only had one for the whole village, and they did manage to blow that up. And so those villages are without heat. But again, people are surviving. People are not going to freeze to death in Ukraine because Russia takes away the heat or the electricity. And like I said, it's almost like Russia thinks it's going to annoy us to death by striking at the civilian infrastructure. Now, when it comes to the 152 millimeter shells you're talking about, I have in the places where I have been on the front line, which is out near Kharkiv, down in the south near Mykolaiv and Kherson, and in Zaporizhia last week, and a place called Pisky, which is in Donetsk province, south east of Dnipro. I have not seen a shortage of 152 millimeter rounds. They are relying increasingly on American standard or Western standard 155 millimeters, and they have quickly used up most of their 152s, and they've worn out their 152 artillery pieces. And so they're using them more sparingly and making more use of the 155s, partially because the 155s are far more accurate and because they still have a supply train of those coming in. They're also making heavy use of the longer range HIMARS. And again, rather than try to shoot 1,000 artillery rounds at the 10,000 troops that are right there on the front lines, they're shooting 1 or 2 HIMARS at the logistics hub that is supplying those 10,000 troops and essentially cutting those 10,000 troops off from their supplies. Those 10,000 troops now have no food, no ammo, no gasoline, and then those guys either give up or run away. And so that's their strategy, and it's working pretty well. They're doing a pretty good job at that, and they know very well where to hit because the United States is providing signals intelligence to the Ukrainians in massive quantities. I mean, we have made a huge difference on this battlefield. People say the United States is not directly involved. They are. The United States is directly involved in this conflict. They're just not doing it from inside Ukraine. They're doing it from the skies above Poland with an AWACS, and they're looking at the radio traffic and the cellular traffic. Because the Russians, unfortunately for them, don't have very good secure communications. So they're relying on cellular phones to call their higher headquarters, and the AWACS can see that. It shows where all those cellular calls are coming into. It finds that location, and it calls the Ukrainian citizens, hey, it'd be a really good idea to drop a bomb on this grid coordinate right now. And they do that. They've killed more than 130 generals so far in this war, and several hundred flag officers so far on the Russian side. The life expectancy of a Russian officer in Ukraine is pretty low right now. So again, I don't see the Russians having a counteroffensive, a major counteroffensive in the winter. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to solidify their lines, dig in, and stop everything where it is, just solidify. And meanwhile, build up more conscripts and more troops, do some more training in the rear, and so that they can push a new offensive in the spring.
If they do push it again, you're going to run into the same issues they did last time because of the weather dying
Even
out
worse,
and your armor
because it
having
gives the
problems.
Ukrainians more time to. Yeah, the Ukrainians are doing a much better job at mobilization, and they have a much better pool of weapons to supply those mobilized troops. And they've got a huge training tail in the rear. They've got thousands of troops training in Poland with the United States. They got thousands of troops training in the UK, and they're even sending troops to the United States to train. So these Ukrainians are getting better and better and better trained and more experienced on the battlefield. So it's not going to be any easier for Russia. Russia has lost more than half of its total active tank force already in Ukraine. The tanks that they have in reserve are, they've got 6,000 to 10,000 tanks in reserve, but these are tanks that have been sitting in storage for 10 years. You don't just pull those out and drive them to the front. And these are older tanks, practically museum pieces in some cases. We've seen T-55 tanks being thrown into the fray on the side of the Russians. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's like they're stealing them off of monuments someplace and sending them into battle. So even more, daunting than that is training up a crew that knows how to run a tank. So that the other thing that we're seeing on the Ukrainian side is just the unbelievable use of drones. You've all seen the footage of Ukrainians, using drones and dropping them on top of troop concentrations and things like that. That's fun. But even more incredible is that within a very short period of time, a matter of months, the Ukrainians have been working on systems that will allow drone swarms. Now get this. It's one thing for an operator to fly a drone somewhere. They've hacked these Chinese-made DJI drones to allow them to fly them up to 19 kilometers away from the operator. That's unbelievable. And so they can push out their ability to do reconnaissance and ISR pretty far. But what they're working on now are swarms of hundreds of drones that will be autonomous, that will go out and will fly over a certain area, will high resolution photograph every square inch of that area, come back, feed all of that data into a computer, a very powerful computer that will stitch it all together into a gigapan photograph that gets looked at by an AI, and then fly another sortie of those drones out over the same area the next day or a few hours later or whatever, and bring back and create another gigapan. And the AI will be able to look at those very detailed photographs and will be able to tell you, it will be able to see tracks from a vehicle that drove by in the mud. It'll be able to see a new foxhole that wasn't there before and identify any changes in that area, and they'll know right where to bomb. You talk about an area denial capability. It's like something we've never seen before. And I was talking to a guy who's here as a computer programmer that's actually working on the machine learning capabilities for that kind of area denial tactic. It will be an absolute game changer. And I guarantee you, the United States Pentagon is watching this very closely, and they're absolutely giddy at what they are learning about drone warfare in this conflict. The money that the United States is spending on this war is a drop in the bucket, and I guarantee you, if you had offered this to the generals at the Pentagon and said, hey, all you have to do is spend $8 billion and you'll have a laboratory in which to test these new technologies, and, oh, by the way, figure out whether or not American capabilities are superior to Russian capabilities in real time, in real combat conditions. the generals would have written that check all day long, and that's what they're getting out of this conflict.
Well, they are. I mean, the entire Ukraine, Ukraine as a nation has become a training area for us to test the type of systems that we have out there, what their capability is. I know that Elon Musk's Starlink also has been helping because, even in the underground bunkers that the Ukrainians are running these drone operations out of, that is a very needed piece that is allowing them to be able to really have accurate targeting when it comes to how close they can get to the specific target that they're trying to hit. And it's really helping when it even comes in the timely targets that are popping up on the battlefield. I do want to talk about a couple of things. I know you said there's a drop in the bucket as far as the money we have spent from the United States, which is in the billions, in order to be able to support Ukraine in this effort in this war. I know with new Congress coming in, there's been some questions as to we want to know the full range of where this money is going, whether or not we can sustain this type of a support. And as you know yourself, Chuck, most wars, whether it be Vietnam, whether it be the British fighting against the Americans in the Revolutionary War, it usually ends when the purse strings are cut more than the guys on the battlefield. One of the issues that we're dealing with, we know that as of just a couple of weeks ago, even with the Javelin system that we provided to the Ukrainians, we saw that the problem was that the U.S. never really properly planned for having the Javelin system as a whole with its battery system that it needs to be manufactured together. So now you're getting third-party batteries being used on these Javelin systems, and our viewers can literally Google search, Javelin battery, and they could go buy it off of, Google somewhere. And unfortunately, they're not meshing well with the systems that we're sending downrange. And it's not that the Russian anti-tank systems of old are outperforming us, or maybe possibly they may have gotten ahead of us when it comes to our ability with the Javelin. And keep in mind, the Javelin is a whole system. It's not something that just popped up yesterday. Where are we from your perspective on the political possible world? What are you hearing in the chatter, whether or not the U.S. is going to be able to, in the long run, maybe in another year, still continue to give the type of support that allows the Ukrainians to not just sustain, but possibly maybe gain the territory back that the Russians may have already taken from them?
That is the most important question you've asked me so far. And this is incredibly it's incredibly important that the American people have a clear understanding of what we're actually spending over here and what we're getting for what we're spending. Now, by comparison, just to give you a little baseline, Joe Biden's plan to forgive student debt is slated to cost the United States $300 billion if it were to go through, which it probably won't. We, in Afghanistan, for 20 years running, we spent an average of $1 billion a week. That would be, $52 billion a year for 20 years running in there. And we left behind $86 billion when we walked away from Afghanistan. Okay, so just keep those numbers in mind as I go forward and talk about what's actually happening in Ukraine. Now, both sides of the political spectrum in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, are using statistics to lie about Ukraine for political purposes. And they're both lying about the numbers in similar ways, and they're both incorrect. So let's break it down. The amount of money, you have to make a difference between the money that has been pledged for Ukraine, the money that has been allotted from what was pledged, and the money that has been spent from what was allotted. Okay, those are three different things, because the money that's been pledged means basically nothing. It's like when you call the Jerry Lewis telethon and tell them you're going to give them $100 a month going forward. You're not obligated for that. You're just sort of making a pinky promise that you're going to send that money. So the next Congress or the next administration could very easily, and guaranteed they will, change the numbers that have been pledged to Ukraine. And the needs on the ground might change, and so we might need to send them more or less than what we've pledged anyway. The amount that's been already allotted is, sort of been set aside now in order to be used in Ukraine, but that money then has to go through a process of being spent out. So the amount that's been pledged is somewhere over $90 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but again, that's just a little more than what we left in Afghanistan when we walked away from there. And that's a little more than 10% of the Pentagon's budget for 1 year. Okay. And again, if you had said to the generals, hey, you write a check for $20 billion and you get this laboratory where you can test everything out, they would have done that. They would have gladly done that. Okay. So that right there is worth it. However, of the money that's been pledged and the money that's been allotted now, much of it doesn't actually help Ukraine. It's not actually going to help Ukraine. It's being spent on other things. So I'll give you an example. Of the $40 billion that was voted on by Congress earlier in the year, $21 billion of that is slated to be paid out in future years, going all the way out to 2030. So none of that has actually been spent yet, of that $21 billion. So that's stuff that if Ukraine is still around and if they still need this money, and then we'll talk about spending that and how we will spend it. It might be loan guarantees or something that's not actually giving cash to Ukraine. Of the $19 billion that's left from that $40 billion, $9 billion of that was going to the Pentagon to buy new toys, to help replace the $3 billion of old, worn out toys that they were going to throw away anyway. You realize how much the Pentagon actually throws away every year, what they waste. I mean, the Pentagon says, oh, these old obsolete weapons, they'll just destroy them. We've to this day got warehouses full of old PVS-7 and PVS-14 night vision that we could give to Ukraine, but they say, oh, ITARs, let's not do that, and that's sitting there. So they'll probably just burn those things or just, shred them or something, right? They waste more stuff. It would make most Americans sick to their stomachs to see what the United States wastes, the military blows up every year. When we left Panama, after the invasion, we collected up millions of dollars worth of ammunition, and they put it all in a big hole, and they blew it to Kingdom. They blew it up rather than take it back to the States. And you know why? Because they were too lazy to have to count it when we got back to the States. They didn't want to have to account for every round and go through and account for every law, every grenade, everything. So they said, we're just going to blow it all up. And they blew millions of dollars worth of ammo. They do that all the time, okay? So rather than blow that old ammunition up or blow those old javelins up or blow those things, when we replace them with new stuff, they just gave them to Ukraine. It's actually cheaper for us to do that. But they gave away $3 billion. They gave the Pentagon $9 billion to replace it with better toys. That's part of that $40 billion. $4.1 billion of that $19 billion that's left over goes to pay for U.S. troops in Poland. That doesn't help Ukraine at all. That just bolsters our presence for NATO, right? Over $4 billion of that was loan guarantees to our partners like Lithuania and Estonia and Finland and places like that to entice them into moving away from old Soviet hardware and buying American hardware. That doesn't mean we're going to spend the money. It means if they make an order and can't pay for it, then we'll back up their loan. And so we might have to pay for it. It's like you co-signing on a loan for your kid. if he doesn't pay for the car, then it falls on you to have to pay for it. But it's likely your kid will pay for it because he's a responsible person. So a lot of that money is not actually money that we're ever going to have to spend. If we do have to spend it, it's going to be spent at Raytheon and not or Boeing and not be sent to Ukraine. Okay, so then the question comes to what has actually been spent in Ukraine. What has actually been sent here to actually help Ukrainians so far this year? Well, what that number is just under $8 billion. Just under $8 billion. The Congress spends more than that on lunches every year, most likely. Okay, $8 billion is less than 1% of the Pentagon's budget. Okay, 50% of that is going for humanitarian aid. So $4 billion is going to actual weapons. Okay, so then even with that, so it's a tiny fraction. $4 billion is about $80 from every family in the United States, every taxpayer in the United States, about 80 every tax states. That's what that comes down to. Now, of that $4 billion worth of ammunition, the concern is that we're sending weapons over to Ukraine. We don't know what's happening to them. They're probably being sold on the black market right out the back door. I've been spending the last month tracking the accountability systems that are in place to keep track of these weapons that are getting sent to Ukraine. First of all, I followed them from Poland, from Czechia, Poland, where they get flown in and then get put on trucks and they get driven. I'm not going to say exactly what happens or how they get into Ukraine because that's important information that the Russians don't know. But I tracked them all the way into Ukraine and tracked them literally right to the front lines. These drones, some of the humanitarian aid, and some of these heavy weapons. Track them right to the front lines. And I wish I could tell you some of the stories about how they're getting out there because they're actually kind of humorous. The way that they're hiding them in plain sight so that they don't look like military trucks shipping weapons out to the front lines. But suffice to say, it's kind of amusing how they're doing it. But they are getting it out there. Okay. And they are getting right to the front lines where they're needed. The troops are saying they're getting what they need to do that. The accountability systems that are in place, both from the United States side and from the Ukrainian side, get this, they are literally more stringent than the accountability practices that the U.S. Pentagon has to adhere to in the United States. The U.S. Pentagon could not pass. They don't pass their own stringent standards. They could not pass the ones that Ukraine is passing right now. And Ukraine, I just talked to the president's advisor. I actually have a piece that's coming out this week about that. I talked to his advisor and he said, we're passing all these things and we welcome more. If you want to send whatever accountability procedures you want to put in place for Ukraine, we're welcoming. We understand how important it is that you can trust that this money is going where it's supposed to go and these arms are going where they're supposed to go. They have, in two instances that I've been able to find, they have had problems with small arms, a few AKs and grenades. We're not talking about HIMARS, but a few AKs or whatever getting sold on the black market. They were caught, they were arrested, and they are being prosecuted. And it was all over the press here in Ukraine. The Ukrainian press is salivating to find some hint of impropriety when it comes to that stuff. And I'll just say this in closing. If I were to report on that here, and I have, the Ukrainians have no problem. They welcome me. There's virtually no place I cannot go. There's virtually nothing I cannot report on that's not it doesn't impact operational security. They allow me to do my job here in Ukraine. If I were in Russia and I were reporting on graft, corruption, fraud in Russia, what do you think my life expectancy would be? Right? What do you think my life expectancy would be? Now, look, it's almost impossible to sell a HIMARS on the black market. By the time my concern was, this was one thing I asked.
If you can do it, you'll make a lot of money, that's for sure.
Yeah, we're going to sell a HIMARS to Hezbollah. You're like, that's just not going to happen. It's not like that'd be an easy thing to do. But my question was, okay, these are still durable and fungible systems. Can we ask for them back at the end of the war? I mean, can we say, hey, once you guys are done with these things, we want them back. We want to account for them. Because I know I had to turn my gun in when I got finished fighting in Panama. They made me, sign a hand receipt for that thing. And they said, no, we're not going to ask for them back. By the time the Ukrainians get finished with these things, they're going to be so worn out, they're not going to be worth anything to begin with. But secondly, we want to encourage Ukraine to transition to American military hardware. Yeah. And so, the supply chain of spare parts and ammunition and stuff, that all gets made in the United States. And so that's an ongoing economic benefit to the U.S. to have another country that's buying our equipment.
No, I can attest to the fact that the previous Ukramesh lead was, there's corruption that was involved. And, to this day, you still don't know, is he in prison or did he end up dead somewhere? Because I know that from the contracting officers, at least I could tell you there are 4 of them that faced criminal charges, because we do have to try to support the Ukrainian government with what it needs, and having folks on the ground and understanding the process. Even the State Department really has to work with the Ukrainians, their defense attaché in the different countries, to do a quality assuring on the front end to make sure that the right ammunition is moving. Unfortunately, the corruption comes in when people try to backdoor you or try to constantly request for more money in order to be able to, get the stuff moving in. So if you could avoid those folks, you can clean those guys out, I think you'll have a much better, much more, I can say not better, but more confidence possibly from some of the folks that have to work with the Ukrainians that are in the bowels of, trying to move this equipment forward on the ground. I know exactly what you're saying about how it moves, from where it needs to into Ukraine. That's a completely different story by itself. One day maybe we'll do a movie about it, but not now. Sometime in the future, probably a decade from now. But it's very interesting, and the polls have been wonderful as far as ensuring that everything flows through the way it should to support the Ukrainian frontline soldiers. I do want to touch a couple of things, which is very important, especially for our audiences here, and everything falls into the political arena. And we're short on time, so I know, and I don't want to keep you too long, but what happened with this FTX issue, with the money came in directly from the U.S., the Ukrainians bought the FTX currency, and then as we know, FTX really defaulting and falling apart basically on what its business model was. If you could just shortly touch upon that. And also I want to ask you, because I know that we got the word that Zelensky is trying to put major restrictions against the Russian Orthodox Church. I know in one of the videos you got a pastor there. I'm not sure if he's tied to any of the Orthodox churches or not, but if you just kind of give us a little bit understanding of those two
very
pieces
good questions
on the ground.
Let me touch on the church thing first very quickly. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has a couple different factions. One of them is tied to the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's the one that they're most concerned about. Again, this is one of those cultural things most people in the United States have no idea. But during the Soviet Union, of course, Christianity was highly discouraged, and it was impossible to stamp it out completely. And so what the Russians did, rather than beat them, they joined them. And they essentially, I'm told that virtually every priest in the Russian Orthodox Church was a member of the KGB. And so they were there to report on what people were saying in the church, report on who was coming to church. And what they have found is that that didn't end at the end of the Cold War, that these Russian-aligned Ukrainian Orthodox churches, the priests in those churches are still members of the FSB. And what they did is they raided a bunch of the churches and they found target maps, they found Russian passports, they found Russian propaganda materials that the priests were handing out to their parishioners to try to change their minds about the war. And so it's just, they're just like, yeah, we're not doing that. These guys are not allowed here. They're out. Persona non grata. They're not banning the church per se. They're just banning the priests that are in those churches and saying, we're shutting those down. That's not happening. As far as the FTX issue goes, again, this is one of those things where details matter. It's like when people say that Oliver North sold weapons to the Iranians and gave the money to drug runners in Costa Rica. That is, there's a shred of truth in what happened there. Oliver North gave weapons to Iranian dissidents who were against the Iranian army, not the Iranians themselves. And the money was going to help the Contras in Costa Rica, not the drug runners in Costa Rica. Those little details change the story 180 degrees. So as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, they have been receiving donations from all over the world since this war began. And one of the ways that they've been receiving donations is people donating cryptocurrency. They've received tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. Well, as you know, you can't spend cryptocurrency to buy blankets or to buy, food or to buy, weapons. You have to somehow exchange that cryptocurrency for fiat money, for actual money.
Yeah. Yes.
Sam Bankman-Fried offered to allow them to exchange the currency, the cryptocurrency that they'd been given on his FTX exchange into fiat currency at basically zero cost. And so Ukraine happily took advantage of that and exchanged that crypto for real money on FTX. That is the limit of what Ukraine had to do with FTX. They were not laundering any money back to the Democratic Party. The Ukrainians, let me just tell you this, and I know we're short on time, and so I think we could probably end it on this. I have gotten pretty close to a lot of the advisors to the president here, to President Zelensky. All of them tell me Zelensky is the man that you see on TV. He is the guy who picks up the heaviest load first and sets it down last, who sets an example for his people. There's so much floating around on the internet, so many unbased rumors about Zelensky putting all this money in his pocket that is patently untrue, about Zelensky being very corrupt. There's been virtually no evidence of corruption from Zelensky. Show me the evidence. Somebody that's one of your listeners, contact me and show me the evidence of Zelensky being corrupt. The people who know him best tell me he's a regular guy who is, holding himself to the same standards that he's holding all of his soldiers to. He's not afraid to go visit them on the front lines, and he's doing what a leader would do in this country. And I would just say to that question, if the United States was Ukraine and Zelensky was Donald Trump, what would you want Donald Trump to do differently than Zelensky has done in this war? Ask yourself that question. And if you have an answer for that, that's a good answer, please contact me and let me know. But I have not seen anything that I could fault Zelensky for so far in this war. I'm not an acolyte of Zelensky. I've met him a couple times, but I'm just saying that I know what leadership looks like, and it doesn't look like Joe Biden. I know what leadership looks like, and it looks like what Vladimir Zelensky is doing for his country. I will tell you that, according to his friends, he absolutely despises Joe Biden and the globalists that he's having to suck up to get these weapons. He does not like these latte drinking liberals by any stretch. Zelensky is happy to sit down with them and happy to ask them for money, but he despises them mostly because the one thing they wanted from him was for him to cut and run at the beginning of this thing. And that made him just absolutely disrespect those people 100%. He said, I don't need to run. I need ammo. Send me ammo. And what he did is he called their bluff. And he said, you guys believe that?
Yeah.
You say you believe in Ukraine, you want to help Ukraine, let's put your money where your mouth is, because this is not charity. We're not asking for charity in Ukraine. This is a partnership. We will spend our blood if you spend your money, and we will defeat Russia so that they will not be a threat to the world body for a generation to come.
Oh, look, we can end it there, Chuck. The unfortunate thing I would say Zelensky is that sometimes the partners that you think are your partners may not be your partners. They might be there for ulterior motives. And again, I hate to say it, like to this day, I have friends of mine that are doing, EOD operations in Cambodia. They're still pulling ordnance out of the ground. Ukraine for the next 75 years, they're going to be pulling depleted uranium, rounds and anything else that they can find. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the war is ending anytime
hundreds
soon.
every day.
So
I interviewed a guy last night that's out doing that, and every day they're pulling that stuff out. It's going to be decades. Amazing. It's going to be long after you and me have become fairy dust. Look, Chuck, you're doing a yeoman's work out there. I know we're short on time. I don't want to just keep you on. I know you got to charge all your equipment. For our viewers, please take a look at the QR code down below. You can see everything that Chuck has been involved in. Chuck, how can people help you directly while you're on the ground in Ukraine? What are some of the things that you need to be able to continue providing us the valuable information that you are? I'm only going to be here in Ukraine for another couple of days, but I'm going to go home for Christmas. And I may come back in February. I may not. There's a lot of other wars in the world that need covering too. But it just depends on the situation here on the ground. People can follow me at chuckholton.locals.com or go to my YouTube page, The Hot Zone with Chuck Holton, and follow me there. Much appreciated, Chuck. And for our viewers, as you all know, with Christmas season coming up, as Chuck mentioned, United Assyrian Appeal, we're, in our Christmas drive, trying to support the Assyrian Christians of Northern Iraq. And also this year is our closeout for supporting the South Sudanese Christians with everything that is happening with the crisis in energy, with the war continuing. We are going to still have the issues of possible famines. Look, there's a lot of economists here, Chuck, that are saying by March our economies are going to implode. We're probably going to have another crash in the stock market. And these are smarter people than you and me. So I'm not sure where we're going to be globally when it comes to this war in Ukraine, specifically in the upcoming famine. And stock up. Stock up, like you said. And for our viewers out there, look, Sim Production has been producing our shows from day one. And, give Fred his dues. He's sick, but he's on the other end making sure we're able to get Chuck here today in order to be able to continue our discussions on Ukraine. Chuck, we're going to leave with a video that you covered for us. Thank you, buddy. Be safe the last 2 days coming back, and we'll talk face to face and share some more stories tomorrow. And God bless you. Keep you safe. And Merry Christmas regards to the family. Merry Christmas. God bless. These new paradigms. Cool.
After Kherson was abandoned by the Russian army, Ukrainian soldiers entering the city were immediately ambushed, though not by the enemy. Beleaguered residents rushed them with tearful hugs and kisses. Not long before, civilians shouted at the last Russian troops fleeing for the east bank of the Dnieper River. As soon as they had gone, these young people set about tearing down posters the Russians had put up.
You have to have something which you live for, and this was the moment to live for. Liberation is not something happening every year. It's something in 5 generations, and it's a moment to stay.
For residents who suffered under Russian occupation, the last 9 months have been full of terror.
We knew only fear. We were afraid of everything. We were afraid of the sound of cars. We were afraid of using our telephones. We were hiding everything. We were hiding our kids.
More atrocities come to light with each passing mile, and Ukrainian authorities plan to thoroughly investigate them all. Kherson was spared destruction seen in other battles because the liberation came without the brutal house-to-house fighting normally required to dislodge an entrenched enemy. They did it by the clever use of two particular weapons, and you might be surprised to find most of the fighting was being done from underground. I visited the front lines in Kherson during the last days of the battle. If you're a soldier in this conflict, the most dangerous thing that can happen is being seen by the enemy, because if they know where you are, they can shoot you. So I'm embedded with a unit right on the front lines, and I want to show you their headquarters, but I have to be very careful about how I do that so that I don't give away their position. Miles from Russian troops, deep in a hand-dug bunker, commanders monitor troop movements via a fleet of off-the-shelf drones broadcasting over a Starlink internet connection. Once an enemy tank is identified, the location is relayed to an artillery unit, which loads a GPS-guided artillery shell provided by the United States. The results speak for themselves. Now, experts say Russia's options are decreasing rapidly.
So missile attacks is pretty much the only thing they have to make Ukraine suffer, but that tactic is not working. And we have seen, since Russia destroyed almost 40% of Ukrainian energy grid, Ukraine still maintains its functioning, and Western assistance is actually increasing, not decreasing.
But here in Kherson, it will be a long time before things get back to normal.
It's difficult to live here. There is no water, no electricity, no heating, it's freezing, there is no internet. We are surviving the best we can.
While residents are eager to rebuild, now is the time to celebrate. It might be almost winter, but for the people of Ukraine, today feels like springtime. From Kherson, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.